Mark Rogers, TV Talking Ohio State football. We bring in Tony Gerdeman from the Ozone. You can join him right there for the very best in Ohio State football. Tony goes to the news conferences, goes out to practice, so he's right there, up close and personal, knows Buckeyes football like just about nobody else. Tony, how you doing tonight?
Doing good. Thanks for having me on again.
Definitely. So we wanted to talk this one up for sure, and maybe we'll have you back on before the game to talk up USC and really break down the personnel. But before we get to this matchup, want to get your thoughts on Ohio State's psyche as a team coming off the disappointment of winning the Big Ten championship, placing themselves in position to get to the college football playoff, getting let down the next day at noon, and where you think the collective minds of the team are. I know Urban Meyer put on a good face before the public and has to, and before the media the next day. And he's one to be able to right the ship very quickly and present another goal and another mission. But this one might be a little bit difficult to sell.
Well, I think the good thing is that it's against a named program in USC, so you don't have to convince the players that this is a big game. But it was interesting. The day of the announcement, we had a press conference, and Urban Meyer spoke, and JT Barrett spoke, and senior linebacker Chris Worley spoke. And I asked Worley, like, do you go into this Cotton Bowl and want to prove the committee wrong? He's like, well, it wouldn't make any difference now, So they're more for some of them, there's no reason to, I guess, prove the committee wrong. For others, they want to show that they're one of the four best teams, or one of, the best team in the nation, really. They want to prove themselves that way against USC in a Cotton Bowl, in a big game. They're still the Big Ten champions. And so there's weight to that, and they don't want to finish with a fizzle. They don't want to finish as anything other than champions. So this, with just one game remaining, they don't have to hold anything back. That's what, Sam Hubbard, the defensive end, was saying. The seniors don't have to hold anything back. This is their last game. They don't have to worry about another game after this. So that, they're planning to give their all. They're all saying the right things so far. And it hasn't been a matter of like getting players to be in the mood to play in bowl games. They've done pretty well. They did in the Fiesta Bowl against Notre Dame a couple years ago. Whereas last year, I think it was more personnel and coaching that did them in against Clemson, not any sort of mental not wanting to be there. Obviously, it was a playoff, so it's a different situation. But no, I think they're devastated and they're disappointed, but they move on pretty quickly.
You can take that 2015 situation two different ways. On one hand, they had the target on their back from the preseason. Number one, loaded with NFL talent, expected to be a consensus wire-to-wire champion. Then they lose to Michigan State the week before the Michigan game, and there was little expectation because of the way the cards were dealt across the nation that they could play themselves back into it. So you could say on one hand, they knew for quite some time, hey, this is most likely not going to happen. But these were the expectations for the entire season. The expectations are always going to be to get to the playoff for Ohio State. But this season was kind of up and down, and especially after the Iowa loss, some would concede, how in the world are they going to play themselves back into it? Then they do, and then they come down with a thud, not in terms of their performance on the field, but in terms of the delivery of the information in the final college football playoff rankings. So in terms of a letdown going into the next game, you could kind of compare those two separate situations to a certain extent, I would think.
Yeah, and I think that's that Iowa game came after the Penn State game, which was a huge emotional high. And then they weren't able to regroup, I guess, and play, well enough to beat Iowa. And, you think of that Michigan State loss in 2015. After that game, Taylor Decker, the left tackle, said if they can't get back up from this and play Michigan and beat Michigan, then all their culture basically on the football program, the culture of the football program was a lie if they couldn't bounce back from that. So, they can handle these ups and downs, but they still have them, and so is this layoff from getting snubbed, if you will, not getting into the playoffs, will it allow them to get back on their feet and get their mentality right? I mean, they're going to be going through practices, and if they're not practicing well, they're going to hear about it. And when I asked the players, the whole talk about players skipping bowl games, I asked several Buckeyes about it, and it's the furthest thing from their mind. They couldn't imagine any of their teammates leaving or not playing in a bowl game. I asked Sam Hubbard, who he's a fourth-year junior. He's could come back. He could go. Nobody really expects him to come back. I asked him, has it ever been in your, have you ever thought about not playing? Is it in your mind at all? And he said, like, not in my mind at all. I asked JT Barrett, and he couldn't imagine anybody sitting out this bowl game. Billy Price said it would never happen. So this is the mentality of the team. And you asked about is this a letdown or anything like that? What they're saying is it's another opportunity to play together, to take part in the brotherhood, which is what they're always talking about, this brotherhood. And it's an opportunity to send the seniors out, and to set the tone for next season as well, because it's not just about this year. It's about leaving the place better than when it was when you found it, when you got here. That's Jamarco Jones, the left tackle, senior, wants to lay the groundwork for the guy who's going to take over for him. And that's just the mentality in the program, but they still have to go out and execute against a pretty good USC team.
Tony Gerdeman from the Ozone joining us to talk Ohio State football as the Buckeyes prepare for their Cotton Bowl Classic game against USC, of course, riding a 7-game losing streak all-time to USC, going back to the 1974 Rose Bowl. So, Tony, before we focus on the matchup here, your thoughts about the Ohio State-Alabama comparison, what you thought the committee did versus what you thought should have happened, and because they obviously both had their arguments and they were very different arguments.
Yeah, and I think this year there were 3 deserving teams and maybe not any more than that. And so then you have to compare Ohio State and Alabama. And when the committee says that it was close between Ohio State, Alabama, and a couple of other teams in there, and then you see Ohio State beat the number 4 Wisconsin team and not get that bid, you have to feel kind of duped by the committee that you can't really believe what they're saying, because obviously they weren't that close, because Alabama still got the nod despite losing their way in. And what I always go back to then is that the Iowa game. You can't lose like that on the road and expect to maybe get the benefit of the doubt. And I don't ever see Nick Saban's Alabama team losing like that. So when Alabama gets that spot that Ohio State wanted, I don't have a huge complaint, or I don't have an argument, I would say. What my problem would be is just the way the committee framed it before the Big Ten Championship, and then the way they framed it after the Big Ten Championship. And they really, I think I tweeted the day after, like, it was this Big Ten Championship game was as meaningless as all of the basketball Big Ten Championship games, because the brackets are already announced before that, are already put together before that game, and they don't even take it into consideration. And it's pretty clear that same thing happened this time. I don't know if Ohio State needed another 59-0 win. Maybe that would have changed things. But it was clear that Alabama fans were rooting for Ohio State. The committee was rooting for Ohio State. And I think those two groups were rooting for Ohio State just as much as Buckeye fans were, because once Ohio State won, then the committee could do what they wanted with Alabama. And, because they would have had to put Wisconsin in. And obviously, they did not want to do that. And so I think they got their way with the win by Ohio State.
The Big Ten Championship game turned out to be just as meaningless as the Iron Bowl, which actually turned out to be counterproductive, because Alabama was not forced to play one of the top 5 teams in the country and risk its spot in the college football playoff. And then the team that was positioned to go to the college football playoff had to play another game, Auburn, and they, of course, lost that game and got knocked out of the college football playoff. So, if anything, I will be tempted to point out to SEC fans and those fans of Alabama and Auburn in particular that their game's not quite as important as they think it is, especially when it's actually counterproductive to the team that wins and benefits the team that loses, at least here in 2017. So I'm not going to go through all the obvious metrics and the comparisons that we've both made, I'm sure, on a number of platforms back and forth, except for one thing that drives me nuts is that, okay, this Iowa game points out one metric that the committee uses is not just to evaluate the wins and losses based on the result of the game, but in the ugliness of the loss or the dominance of the win. So this obviously turned out for Ohio State's detriment, getting blasted by 31 points against Iowa. But if you take out Ohio State's best two wins, Penn State and Wisconsin, go to its third best win, Michigan State, which is comparable to Alabama's best win against LSU or Mississippi State, most likely LSU because Mississippi State dropped its last game without its quarterback, Nick Fitzgerald. Alabama beats Mississippi State in the last minute of the game, a game that they were being outplayed most of the game. They beat LSU. Yes, they were decidedly the better team, but it was a fourth quarter game, 24-10. It was a one-score game. Fourth quarter, they win by 2 scores. Okay, LSU, Michigan State. If you're going to discredit Ohio State for the awful loss in terms of point differential against Iowa, then you need to at least recognize and give them credit for the Michigan State win, 35-3 at half, could have named their score 48-3 final. So a dominant win against a quality opponent versus just barely beating or decidedly, but only winning a decent performance against an LSU team that's comparable to Michigan State. That, I don't know, was taken into consideration with the same weight or maybe even any weight. Doesn't from the rhetoric out there, it doesn't seem like it was given any weight versus what the Iowa game was given.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And then also when the committee that week leading up puts Fresno State in the top 25, that was a huge red flag. And, you know, that maybe was Alabama's third best win. And you look at Ohio State, their least important win was UNLV maybe. UNLV beat Fresno State this year. You know, so there's a very an Army beat Navy. You know, Army had a really good year this year. Ohio State beat them. So there's the resume, and it's just like that loss to Iowa trumped all of it. It's like you can have, like in the real world, you can have this awesome resume, but if you checked yes next to have you ever been arrested for a felony, it doesn't matter what the rest of it says. And I think maybe the Iowa loss was felonious.
That is a tremendous analogy right there, because that's pretty much what it came down to right there. And you mentioned some of the lesser wins for Ohio State that they were actually somewhat made fun of at some point in terms of saying, okay, well, we saw them against Oklahoma, and then until they didn't play a decent team, Penn State, between those games, it was like, what have they done? Well, those couple teams there turned out to be pretty good. And then I heard a lot about Alabama dominance. Well, that dominance was against really bad teams in the SEC, and that's what you're supposed to do. Well, that's what Ohio State did against Maryland, Nebraska, Rutgers, Illinois. They completely annihilated those teams as well. I didn't see the dominance being out of kilter or not analogous as well. So
yeah, and I'll say one other thing. When the committee says that they wipe everything clean each week, and that they don't look back at last year or whatever, they don't look at conferences, given the fact that they basically lied about Alabama and Ohio State being close, you really can't take anything they say as truth. So I also think the loss to Clemson last year for Ohio State hurt them, because obviously the committee is going to look back on that as well. And they look at the past games between Alabama and Clemson, and obviously those were closer, more entertaining, and just the better product. So I think that loss, that 31-0 loss, hurt last year as well, because I don't believe the committee when they say they wipe everything clean each week. They don't look back at last year, because they've shown that they lie about certain things. So you can't really believe much of anything they would say in their rules and regulations.
They didn't want to pit Ohio State against Clemson, not necessarily thinking Ohio State was going to get destroyed again, but the possibility that it would happen again, they would look just awful in that situation.
And if Clemson blows Alabama out, that's just good television.
Yes, I think for Ohio State fans at this point, it would be good television. All right, Tony Gerdeman joining us from the Ozone. Please join him there for the best in Ohio State football as the Buckeyes prepare, I should say, for the USC Trojans. Your thoughts about USC? Have you seen them play much? Sam Darnold, obviously the guy that everybody knows about, who had a somewhat disappointing turnover-filled season. If you add up the fumbles and the interceptions, they total 20. But in most of the big games, he did have a rough outing, as did the entire team at Notre Dame. He pulled through this team in a number of difficult situations, and Ronald Jones is an explosive back. I actually think, off the top of my head, that this may be the best running back matchup with J.K. Dobbins and Mike Weber, to a certain extent, taking on Ronald Jones. USC and Ohio State, the recruiting rankings have shown us that this will be a talent-laden matchup.
Yeah, and I think that's what I'm looking forward to seeing is USC's outside guys against Ohio State's corners, and see how they match up with Denzel Ward. I've seen a little bit of USC this year. Sam Darnold, just looking at his numbers with the interceptions earlier in the year, but I think in his last 7 games he has maybe 3 or 4 interceptions, so he's cleaned that up. But and maybe it took him a little while to get over the hype that he was receiving for the entire offseason. Ronald Jones, we've seen special running backs can give Ohio State trouble if there's a passing threat that can also occupy the defense, which USC has. Whereas, like against Wisconsin, they don't have that fear of the quarterback, so they shut Jonathan Taylor down. They did very well against Saquon Barkley. So they have the capability of making life really difficult for the running back. But the safeties could be a concern for Ohio State, getting beat deep, or you just over the middle. They've had issues at times this year. They're fairly solid, but if there's a weak spot in the secondary, it would be the safeties and maybe Kendall Sheffield, who is their third corner, who rotates and starts. And you've seen the linebackers have trouble all year in pass coverage. So that will also be an issue because USC can throw the ball over the middle and get some guys in coverage, and Ronald Jones or tight ends, and just pose a problem. And so I think Ohio State will focus a lot on that. In terms of the Ohio State offense, I expect them to be able to run the ball. With J.K. Dobbins and, like you said, Mike Weber. It's going to be interesting to see what Mike Weber does after this season, because will he want to come back and pretty much do this same thing, play behind J.K. Dobbins? So this might be one of those things where he's trying to maybe audition for the NFL, and I think J.T. Barrett's knee is going to be fine, so he'll carry the ball. But he may not need to carry the ball that much because USC also gives up some yards through the air. So I wouldn't be surprised if this is a little bit of a shootout. I think Ohio State might be able to control the ball more, and maybe come that fourth quarter, just put it on the USC defensive line and let the Ohio State offensive line sort of salt things away.
Jack Jones and Iman Marshall, they call him Biggie Marshall, at the corner positions for USC. Ohio State fans might be familiar with the recruitment of Iman Marshall, who was supposed to go to Michigan and then at the last minute decided to opt for USC. Porter Gustin has been down most of the later portion of the season, probably USC's linebacker, although Cam Smith gets most of the attention, had a 3-interception game last year against Utah, but Porter Gustin, a big loss for USC. Deontay Burnett, the guy that really flashed in the Rose Bowl against Penn State, had 3 touchdown receptions against the Nittany Lions last year. Still USC's leading receiver this year. Michael Pittman and Tyler Vaughn's also young players that had an exceptional seasons as the 2 and 3 guys in the wide receiver lineup for the Trojans. All right, Ohio State football talk with Tony Gerdeman right here on Mark Rogers TV as we look at recruiting and a little bit more attention given to this this venture, of course, with the early signing period in Ohio State, by most services, holding down that number one spot for most of the offseason. Tony, I believe we've got a few commits coming in recently.
Yeah, the two this week alone with St. Louis receiver Cameron Babb, 4-star guy. Missed this season with an ACL tear, but Ohio State is used to dealing with that, and they'll get him back and ready to go for the season. And then Tuesday with defensive tackle Tommy Togiai from Idaho. I believe it's the first Idaho player Urban Meyer has ever recruited. You know, it's not exactly a hotbed there, but just a big defensive tackle, 6'3", 290, who moves like a defensive end. If you watch his film, he's kind of long and can get up and down the line and chase running backs. And he's a pretty decent pass rusher. So those are two big guys, two big gets. I think the recruiting class right now is about 21 players. So it's pretty full, but they're still out there trying to get a few more. So where they put them, where they find room for them might get a little interesting. But there'll be obviously some NFL departures and some guys leaving for playing time. But yeah, it's a pretty good class, really good. Well, it's Ohio State's Urban Meyer, so it's a really good class. What it's missing, though, is defensive ends. They don't have any. They lost a 5-star guy, decommitted, Brenton Cox from Georgia. Decommitted. He'll stay down south. And why it's such a concern now is because they'll probably be losing 3 defensive ends to the NFL with Jalen Holmes, Tyquan Lewis are both seniors. Sam Hubbard's a redshirt junior who is graduating, expected to leave early. So that will basically leave them with just 3 defensive ends on the roster. Now they could move a tight end, Rashad Berry, who was a defensive end before moving to tight end. Might have to move a defensive tackle over. But they need some guys. And there's a guy in Cleveland, 4-star guy, Tyreek Smith, who has been waffling back and forth between Ohio State and Penn State. He's really, at this point, he's a must-have just for bodies. And so you don't want to just strike out at a position like this where they have done so well, signing 5-star guys basically every year that Urban Meyer has been at Ohio State with Joey Bosa, Nick Bosa. Chase Young is a guy this freshman this year. Jonathan Cooper came in with Bosa, another 5-star guy. So they've got this history, but right now all of the 5-star guys that they normally get are trending elsewhere. So Tyreek Smith is a huge priority for them, and they won't get left at the altar. They'll get somebody, but I also don't think they'll want to reach and go after somebody who can't play at Ohio State or would necessarily need a redshirt, because they'll need him next year. So they got to get somebody who can play. And a guy who that might be would also already be on the team in Draymond Jones, who's redshirt sophomore defensive tackle, possibly could be headed to the NFL. But he came to Ohio State as a defensive end. He's really athletic, 6'3", 280, who might get a look there if he comes back, and could also maybe increase his draft stock by showing that he could play inside and outside next year. So
Ohio State looking for another stellar recruiting class here in 2018, holding down the number one spot according to most services, and a couple commits coming into the fold in the past week. Cameron Webb, the number 22 rated wide receiver, according to 247 Sports out of St. Louis in particular. Tony Gerdeman joining us from the Ozone to break down Ohio State football with the Buckeyes preparing for the Trojans that last few days of the year down in Dallas at the Cotton Bowl. Tony, we appreciate the time. Hopefully we can flag you down for some USC personnel breakdown. We appreciate it.
Yep, thank you.